So today I wanted to talk a little bit about how virtual reality is not just a engineering research material area in terms of hardware and devices, but it can be a really important area of research for communication scholars and people or scholars in the social science areas. And some of the studies that I will introduce today will sort of demonstrate how you're able to make that approach from virtual reality and looking at it from a much more engineering geared perspective, and sort of rerouting that orientation to think about how we as communication scholars are able to approach this and what are the questions that are meaningful to us. And so of all of the studies that my lab has looked at in the past decade or so, I've sort of selected some of the studies that really demonstrate this perspective. And so hopefully it's interesting for people who are interested in looking at virtual reality or any one of these virtual environments that are really advancing at a breakneck speed, and happens to be one of the hot, areas that people are taking a lot of interest in. So hopefully this is inspiring to many of you who have such an interest. So I'm currently at University of Georgia, and I direct the Games and Virtual Environments Lab. And I did want to begin with sort of a personal timeline of how I've sort of gotten into virtual reality and what that has looked like. And so in 2004, I graduated from Seoul National University. And in 2006, I went to Stanford University to start studying virtual reality. And at that time, a single head-mounted display device cost about $50,000, which is mind-blowing, right? And so you have to think about the fact that this was, again, in 2006. And so the dollar value was a lot higher than what it is right now. And so if you imagine a device, a single device that costs $50,000, it was prohibitive to study outside of dedicated laboratories and research facilities. And then I graduated in 2011 and opened up my own Games and Virtual Environments lab at University of Georgia in 2011. And by that time, a single head-mounted display the price had gone down to about $2,500, which is a surprising jump in sort of the pricing, but still at $2,500, it was still not cheap enough for that to be considered viable for consumer level products. And then in 2012, Palmer Luckey launched the Kickstarter Oculus Rift before it became what it is today. And so at that point, the HMD price was about $600. So you can see how it's really starting to come down in pricing in terms of being accessible and practical. And then in 2014, Facebook famously buys Oculus VR, the company, for about $2 billion. And in 2021, where we are today, the most recent version of that Oculus Quest 2 device is now $250. So here, now we're looking at a possibility where now we're able to think about a world where it can be one person and one device. So it's sort of like your smartphone. Right now we're talking about a potential of having ubiquitous access to these virtual reality devices. And that really changes a lot of the way that we're able to orient, and we're able to look at the development of virtual reality as a communication tool. And the reason being is because we're able to look at virtual reality in a sense where now everybody has one, right? And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But before I begin, I did want to sort of define and discuss what virtual reality is. And so surprisingly, the definition of virtual reality came about in around the 60s. So Ivan Sutherland talked about this mediated world created with multiple sensory cues from digital devices. And this definition, this concept of creating this digital world that's so realistic that it feels like you're there, really hasn't changed much since the 60s. And so virtual reality had multiple waves of people coming up with ideas where, we talk about metaverse today, but that idea has been around since the 60s. And during the past waves of virtual reality's popularity, the cost really hadn't come down to a point where it was popular enough for everyday consumers to gain access to the devices. But now we're talking about that potential being right at the cusp of everybody now being able to access one. But now, are people going to be interested in purchasing one is a different question. But in terms of the pure ability for you to access a device, we have now come to a point where it is technologically feasible. And in terms of the pricing point, that is also feasible as well. The term virtual reality was actually coined by Jaron Lanier in the 80s. And so again, that discussion of, are we able to create this mediated world where it's so realistic that you feel like you're there, has been going on for a while. And that feeling is termed as presence, right? The feeling of being there, as if you feel like you can see, you can hear, and you can touch things as you are in the physical world. That perception is called presence, and we'll refer to that throughout the rest of the talk. Now, why should we care as communication scholars? What's interesting about being in communication as these emerging devices come forth is that these devices don't necessarily change you as a person. So fundamentally, we're all going to be still driven to communicate and to interconnect with each other, regardless of what device is out there. But it does really change how we do that. So how we communicate, that rule of interaction, and it impacts the way that we're able to look at and understand the world. And this is why at this point where now virtual reality can become ubiquitous, where one person is able to have one device at home, is interesting to us as communication scholars, because it does change the normative rules of how we interact with each other. And I really see that through my students and how they use their mobile phones, right? And I was talking to a class where I mentioned that when I was in graduate school, we had a data plan where in each given month, I was given 20 text messages, incoming and outgoing total, right? So after 20 messages, if I had sent or received more than 20 messages, then I had used up that plan. And nowadays, my students were telling me that nobody calls you using your cell phone. Nobody uses the calling feature of a cell phone unless it's a matter of life or death, right? Everybody texts each other. So on average, they're sending and receiving hundreds of text messages. And so the fact that they're communicating really hasn't changed, but how they do that and those rules of interaction will change as these emerging devices come up. And it's not just virtual reality. As these emerging devices come through and become ubiquitous, where everybody has a communication tool that they commonly share, it will change the rules of interactions and how we look at and understand the world in which we live. And so that's why at this point, virtual reality is of great interest to communication scholars. Now, when we look at how we interact and engage with media platforms, there are multiple ways that we're able to approach this. And you may have heard of the term affordance. And so what does that mean? It means that media platforms have different features, and those features will allow different action possibilities. So for instance, virtual reality has a set of features that allow different possible actions versus, let's say, television or mobile phones or computers that have different features that, again, allow for different action possibilities. And what's interesting here is that people have typically approached these features as something that's positive or something that's passive, and the users need to discover it. And without the users discovering this feature, the feature really remains useless, has been sort of the traditional understanding of what these media affordances are. But a upcoming argument, a more recent argument about this is that the features are not necessarily just passive. They're actually intentionally designed to invite certain actions. And so when virtual reality or other media platform have different features that offer action possibilities, they're not just sitting there passively. They are designed to intentionally invite certain actions and have a preference for these actions versus other things. So for instance, we can use a table to set our computers on or have devices on those tables, but we can also use it for sitting. But because the table is designed at a certain height, it doesn't really invite the action of sitting as much as it invites the action of putting objects on that table. And then the users have different characteristics, right? They have expertise, they have experience, they have different individual traits. And the users are, again, not just driven purely by media features. So it doesn't mean that just by merely being exposed to these media features, they suddenly go into this trance and they're magically led to a certain set of actions. Users actually have agency in which they're going to select the specific feature that they are looking for and need in order to take care of whatever specific task that they're interested in. And so when we talk about affordances, it's not just a passive or a static relationship, it's more of a dynamic relationship between the media features inviting certain actions and the users engaging in those actions as a result of certain agency. And they all have intentions and purposes. And then we have to think about the situational constraints during which they are using this media platform. So are they at home? Are they at work? Are they outside? Are they in a certain environment that allows for certain different actions? And we find that users not just use the best media available, they're actually really strategic in using and selecting these different media platforms. And they try to use these features to overcome situational constraints. And so even if virtual reality has a lot of cool technology, it doesn't necessarily mean that users will always choose this platform. They choose it to use these features to break through and to overcome different limitations and constraints of the situation that they are placed in. And so we're looking at virtual reality from this perspective and not necessarily just from the perspective of looking at it as a device. I did want to sort of touch upon how does virtual reality work to persuade the users and how the messages are no longer just static content delivery, but they're delivered more as experiences through immersive and interactive messages that are built into, so they're sort of baked into the structure of virtual reality platforms. So I'll go through this and that'll sort of also, I guess, respond to what Dr. Lee just asked about. So the traditional approaches of communication have really sort of struggled with the fact that information tends to stay abstract. And because a lot of the information, for example, information recently about COVID-19 vaccinations, right? So people are really struggling with the fact that a lot of the information that we're trying to send to users tend to remain pretty abstract. And therefore, the recipients tend to be pretty passive about it. And when they are passive and the information remains abstract, the message effects tend to be fairly short term. And so with a lot of the theoretical approaches in terms of persuasive effects, people have argued that, well, why don't we make the information concrete and then try to get the recipients to be more involved with the message, and that will lead to more lasting message effects. And of course, this sounds very simple on face value, but it's not. And so here are some of the theoretical approaches that people have taken in the past to try to create these concrete message and design message effects that last over time. And so one would be exemplification theory by Zillman, where Zillman argued that people tend to judge a whole by its parts. And so people tend to really focus on clear and salient examples of more abstract phenomena. and that triggers heuristic-based processing. A construal level theory is a more psychological approach that argues that psychological distance between people, the people who are receiving the message and the events and the message itself tends to impact decision making. And so the contextual details of that message can help render the events in a much more concrete way in the mind. And then finally, self-referencing theory really latches onto the fact that the self concept is a really highly organized schema. And because we're really used to the self concept, associating new information with the self tends to activate self schema and facilitates information processing. And so there are other theories out there, but these are some of the examples of theoretical approaches to trying to design concrete messages that have lasting impact. And some of the affordances of virtual reality that address concrete messages or the design of concrete messages is interactivity, immersion, the way that we're able to accelerate time within virtual reality, self-modeling. So these are some of the examples that I'll show you in the next following slide. So again, these are features that can invite and enable certain actions, and users respond to these features in different ways. For instance, they perceive control, they can perceive subjective levels of presence, they can perceive psychological distance, personal relevance. So these are all things that people are able to respond to in ways that media features invite and enable certain actions. And virtual reality, when you are able to experience immersive and interactive content, it's able to provide a level of contextual details that you don't necessarily see with more traditional media, and it's able to mimic firsthand experiences fairly well. And the reason why this is important is because there are several theories that will try to describe why and exactly why we feel one thing. So we intend to do something, but then we behave in another way. And one of these theoretical explanations is the cold to hot empathy gap. And the theoretical explanation here is fairly simple, is that people tend to underestimate the power of the context that they're in or the situation that they're in. And so one example of this is that if you're surveying people about their level of thirst after working out, right? So if you ask people, how thirsty do you think that you're going to feel after working out for an hour before they begin the workout, they may severely underestimate their level of thirst. If you ask the same question immediately after them finishing their workout, then they'll say that they're very thirsty. And so typically when you ask these people about the power of context and situation, people tend to underestimate that. And that has led to lots of, measurement error and issues trying to approach how to assess people's decision-making behaviors when they're not in that situation at that moment. And so virtual reality is able to demonstrate and show and mimic as much as possible what that firsthand experience might feel like by rendering experiences as if they're happening at the moment. Another way that they're able to create concrete messages is through self-modeling. And so we're able to take a frontal photo and a profile picture and essentially do a digital face-off and wrap it around an avatar 3D mesh, thereby creating a photorealistic version of yourself. And we call these virtual doppelgangers. So they look exactly like you, but they can be controlled by others. So I can create an avatar that looks exactly like Dr. Lee, or I can create an avatar that looks exactly like anybody else in this audience. And a third party is able to control that. So once that avatar is created, we're able to make it smile, we're able to make it laugh, we're able to make it engage in movements. And so we're really able to decouple the form and the behavioral factor and really hyper personalized messages so that it's not just about anybody else, it becomes completely about you. So you're able to see your own self in the messages that you receive. And then once we create these avatars, we're able to accelerate time. And I don't know if you're realizing this, but that 30-year-old avatar has now become 65-year-old in a matter of seconds. And so now the perception of time, or that dimension of time, becomes very malleable in virtual reality. So we're able to go forward or backward in terms of the ability to depict time movement and accelerate that at the pace that we want. And this dynamic depiction of future consequences really adds to that sense of immediacy. So typically, when we're trying to send health messages, for example, there's a huge temporal gap between the cause and the effect, and that causal relationship becomes inevitably abstract. But when we're able to show you this acceleration of time and show you the future consequences of your present day behavior, then it really helps to add that sense of temporal immediacy, thereby adding a concrete layer, a concrete understanding to that causal relationship. And so using these concepts of the virtual doppelganger, the acceleration of time, and the contextual details through mimicking firsthand experiences, we tested the idea of creating a virtual exemplar. So in his original theory, Zillman talked about a possibility of an exemplar so concrete and so vivid that it feels as if it's happening to you at that moment. And so that's the line that he discussed in 1999, where this really wasn't technologically feasible. But now we're able to really test out that assumption that sometime in the future, there might be a possibility of this exemplar that's so vivid and so real that it feels like it's happening to you at that moment. And what's really important about these virtual exemplars is that I don't think that they can be used alone, thereby replacing, for example, traditional information. And this is because virtual exemplars do one thing really well, and these are merely examples, right? So examples don't necessarily stand for the whole description, and the same logic applies to virtual exemplars. So they're able to create and deliver that vividness of that situation really well, but it's not able to give you the overall story or the dense information that you would need to understand the complex relationships. So we believe that when virtual reality exemplars are used, they need to be used in tandem with traditional information so that the exemplars highlight an example, a certain aspect of that situation, but you do have the full-blown information to understand the more complex relationships or the complex events that led to a certain occurrence. And so we applied this idea of virtual exemplars to the problem of sugar-sweetened beverages. And the reason being is because we happen to be in the state of Georgia. And based on the CDC report, Georgia is one of the top 5 states for soda consumption. And we are home to the Coca-Cola headquarters, and Coca-Cola does sponsor a lot of the UGA, the University of Georgia events. And a lot of the parents of the students who go to University of Georgia work for Coca-Cola. And so seemingly it's a habit that's harmless. And typically people tend to think, well, it's just a can of Coke a day. It shouldn't be that detrimental to my health. And these are sort of the seemingly harmless habits that are even harder to break, right? So if you want to tell these people that you need to break your habit of drinking sugar-sweetened beverages, it's going to be harder because they don't necessarily perceive risk regarding that behavior. And so we wanted to see whether these virtual exemplars could help us deliver this message that the sugar-sweetened beverages over time, so added over time, are incurring health risks that they should be aware of, and they need to change their behavior to prevent that future consequence from happening in the future. And so this is a pamphlet that was developed by the New York Department of Health. And you can see from the pamphlet's picture that they're trying to say that when you drink sugar-sweetened beverages like soda, you're basically drinking a lot of excess calories, leading to gaining pounds and gaining weight and gaining fat. And so when you look at the content presented in these pamphlets, they will talk about one example. So they'll say, it's generally bad for you, but if you continue to drink one regular can of Coke a day, it's equivalent to gaining about 10 pounds in fat per year, if you just think about the excess calories. And so over 2 years in time, it's equivalent to about 20 pounds in fat that you are gaining if you add up just the excess calories that you're getting from these sugar-added beverages. And so based on this information, again, we are building an example that is featured and highlights the information presented in this pamphlet. And so we built out a virtual world that basically shows you this example in the pamphlet in a much more visceral way. So in this virtual world, a doppelganger of one of our college undergraduate female students is drinking a regular can of soda a day. And you can see that the time is passing in the background. So that's about 2 years in time. And you're seeing the fat fall onto the digital scale and become equivalent of 20 pounds across 2 years in time. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but the avatar has actually gained weight in the abdominal and thigh area, which is where females tend to gain a lot of weight. For the male participants, we built out a different model because they gain weight in a different way. So the weight sort of tends to accumulate in the belly, so they get a gut, and then it sort of tends to add around the facial area. And so the males have a different model of building the 20 pounds in weight. And so we tested the efficacy of this virtual exemplar in tandem with the printed version of the pamphlet. And so across a few studies, we did test out different comparison conditions and whether it has an impact over time. What are the underlying mechanisms of behavioral change? And so I won't go into details of all of these studies. And so what I'm presenting here is going to be a very, very summarized version of everything that we've tested over the years. And what we find is that there is a significant effect over time on issue involvement. So are they interested in this issue when they read the pamphlet alone? So they're reading just the statistics, the base rate, versus when they view just the picture version of the before and after, versus when they view the virtual exemplar. So we see that immediately after, and also 1 week after, we see impacts on issue involvement. We also see impacts on perceived susceptibility. So do they have a higher risk perception? And also, we see that there's a change in beverage consumption that we measure 1 week after people leave the lab. What's interesting is that immediately after, we don't necessarily see changes in the intention, but 1 week after, when we ask about beverage consumption, there is a significant change in the amount of beverage that they consume during that 1 week. And so when we're interested in, well, what exactly is driving these outcomes, the original exemplification theory had assumed that it must be perceived vividness. So the clarity of image and the quality of the image that they're seeing in these messages. But one affordance of virtual reality that could be another potential mechanism is that perception of presence. So we had discussed that perception, the feeling of being located, of being there in that mediated environment. And so when we tested for the underlying mechanisms of these virtual exemplars, in one of the studies, we find that that perception of temporal imminence, that feeling of urgency leads to a reduction in consumption, and that it's not actually vividness, but spatial presence that leads to increased risk perceptions. And so what we see here is that it's not necessarily clarity or the quality or the perceived vividness of that image, but it's more the sense that I'm located there, that my body, that myself is located in that mediated environment that seems to lead to increase in risk perceptions. And so in terms of the original exemplification theory, it tends to focus on other people's mediated experiences being delivered as examples. So, a lot of the traditional exemplification theory scholarship has really focused on interviews or delivering secondhand experiences as examples. And the effect of sensory motor cues really weren't considered just because back in those times, it really wasn't a feature that was available in a lot of the media platforms you were using. And vividness was assumed to be one of the mechanisms. But with these virtual exemplars, when we are mimicking first-hand experiences with a lot of contextual details, it seems that the self-location, that perception of presence, might be important to consider in terms of thinking about the affordances of virtual reality and what really leads to that change in attitudes and behaviors as a result. And so exemplification effects are not driven just by being exposed to virtual reality. So the fact that I just used VR really isn't what's driving these changes in attitudes and behaviors. It's actually fully mediated by the fact that I feel like I'm there. So that sense of presence is seemingly driving a lot of the effects that we see here, rather than the perception of vividness when we compare the two. The second study where I thought that it has a relationship with communication scholarship as we know it is the area of virtual agents and whether we're able to create social relationships with these agents. And so an up and coming area is referred to as human-machine communication, but is this new? Not really. Dr. Lee has a lot of expertise in how people engage and interact with avatars and agents. And we know that there are two different types of virtual representation. So avatars are controlled by humans. What was that? Sorry. So one is avatars, they're controlled by humans, and the other category is agents, and these are controlled by computers or algorithms. And based on a meta-analysis that we conducted in 2015, we know that avatars will wield greater social influence than agents. So people react more strongly to avatars because they're controlled by humans, versus agents that are controlled by computers. But because it can be very impractical to have human controllers behind every single avatar, we can think about instances where these agents and interactions with these agents will serve a lot of purposes that we need in society, right? If we have each human control each avatar that we're seeing in these digital worlds, it just is, it's not practical at all. And so we wanted to think about, well, what does this mean when we are looking at interactions between humans and agents? And this really has been studied over the past few decades. It's not a new up-and-coming idea because we have looked at, within communication scholarship, how human relationships are formed and maintained. So human-human interactions have been studied for a while. But now, in the past decades, we've also been looking at, well, how do humans interact with computers and how do humans interact with representations that are controlled by computers, and also how do humans interact with robots? And so these are not new questions. We have been sort of playing around with the idea that it doesn't necessarily have to be human-human interaction. But now we're looking at a world where the AI platforms are sufficiently developed, they're sufficiently sophisticated to create relationships with humans. So the question now would be, well, can you fulfill the need for social interaction and for social relationships with agents that are not controlled by humans, but are controlled by agents or by computers and algorithms, right? And we wanted to apply this question, this idea, to the problem of obesity in the Southern United States. And I don't know if you all are familiar with it, but this is the bottom map is the 2010 map from CDC that has color coded the prevalence of obesity, and the darker colors will demonstrate bigger problems with weight. And you can see that it's really sort of focused in the southeastern United States areas. The upper panel is a more updated map. I believe it's from 2018. You can see that some of the areas have experienced improvement, but largely the orange, the darker areas are still concentrated in the southeastern United States. And what's really noteworthy about this problem is that childhood obesity is a largely preventable issue, and physical activity tends to be a key predictor of this childhood health. And what health interventions for trying to prevent childhood obesity have really struggled with in the past is that it's really labor intensive, right? And so if you want to conduct an intervention where you go into these schools and you're trying to do a tailored version to try to meet the needs of each individual child, it's too costly and it's too labor intensive. And it makes it almost impossible to scale it up, to make it into a large intervention. And typically the exergame approaches in the past, perhaps because of this issue, really has had limited long-term efficacy. Because it doesn't really, it's not as simple as tossing an exergame to children and saying, well, if you play this exergame, your behavioral problems will be solved, because it's not that simple. And children really need a really sustainable system of social support in order to change their behavior, and not just change it temporarily, but to change it in a way that it becomes a lifestyle behavior. So it's a part of their life and internalized, rather than just a short-term behavior change. And so unless they have a social support system that's baked into their everyday life choices, it's virtually impossible to throw them an exergame and hope that it works. And so we wanted to try to test the idea that virtual agents might be helpful in terms of providing social support, particularly in the context of after-school programs. And so we noticed that there is a ton of children who go to after-school programs in the United States. So it's upwards to the tune of over 8 million children who spend 2 to 3 hours daily in these after-school programs. And we also noted that the staff and resources are stretched so thin that it's virtually impossible to pay one-on-one interaction and attention to these children and provide the level of social support that they need. And so the idea was to try to use virtual agents in tandem with parents who can't be with their children, which is why they're in the after-school programs to begin with. So why don't we add and substitute virtual agents in spots where parents can't be with their children to provide that social support, the feedback, the consistent encouragement that children need in order for them to not just change it temporarily, but change physical activity so that it becomes a more internal behavior. And so we came up with the virtual fitness buddy ecosystem, where we're using consumer grade technologies that are universally accessible. So the Fitbit, the cell phone, computers. So these are all devices that people are largely able to access at any given time. And the parents and children are connected through the virtual pet that we developed. So this is a social agent, an agent that looks like a virtual dog and helps children and parents communicate with each other. And the agent is designed as a customizable pet to leverage that power of human-pet relationship and to lower the expectations of human-like quality. So we don't want a human agent to serve as a coach, because the AI platform really isn't that developed at that point. And so we wanted to use a pet where the interaction expectations are fairly low at that point. And so the interaction cycle that's summarized is fairly simple. So the child will meet the virtual dog wearing an activity monitor. And the virtual dog will ask the child to set a physical activity goal upon meeting. The child will leave the kiosk to engage in physical activity. So we don't want the child to stand in front of the television to engage in physical activity. So we want them to go away, play with their friends, or engage in some sort of a sports activity. And when the child thinks that he or she has met the physical activity goal, they return to the kiosk. The virtual dog is automatically able to download the physical activity data off of the Fitbit. They check the data against the physical activity goal that they set together. And when the child has met that goal, the virtual dog will congratulate the child, and the child can interact with the virtual dog, teach it tricks, or the virtual dog will simply say, if they haven't met the goal, you need to go back and exercise for 10 more minutes. All of this interaction in real time is being updated to the parents via text message so that they're able to send in feedback or words of encouragement, or if they don't have time, they can simply be updated regarding the activities of the child at the after-school program. And so here is a quick video of our earlier prototype version of that virtual pet, just to demonstrate what the interaction looks like between the child and the dog.
I get to choose a name, a color, and a tag color. So I'm going to name this dog Grace. We'll choose red and black. University of Georgia, and our backdrop is University of Georgia buildings and architecture. Sit. Stay. Good dog. Lay down. Stay. Good dog. He doesn't know how to do a whole lot more right now, so I'm gonna have to run out and go do some more exercise. Spin around. Stand. Good. Down. Roll over. Play dead. Moonwalk. Good boy. Fetch. Speak.
And so you kind of get the idea of how this interaction works between the child and the pet. And we went out to several summer camps in the area of the state of Georgia and conducted several pilot studies to see the efficacy of whether this actually works. Compared to a computer system that has the same feature. So it will still allow the child to set and meet physical activity goals. It will give verbal feedback, but without that virtual pet. So that was the control group that we compared the virtual pet against. And across multiple studies that we find that children not only exercise more, but they feel that there is a relationship building with the virtual agent. So when we ask the children, do you feel that this virtual pet serves as a friend? And do you feel that there is a relationship, a friendly relationship between you and the virtual pet? Children tend to respond that they feel high relatedness with their virtual pet. Of course, this is just preliminary at this point. But it does give you a certain idea in terms of, well, what are these long-term interactions with social agents going to look like? And are they going to start feeling that there is a social relationship between you and some entity that continues to give you social support? So feedback, encouragement, helps you set goals, gives you tips on how to meet those goals, interactive play. So when you have these elements over a long period of time, then do children end up building some form of a relationship? And what does that look like? How do they respond? So these are some of the questions that we are interested in asking. And at this point, we are in our 4th year of this intervention, where we track the physical activity data across 1 year in time. We have gone into 20 after-school programs in the metropolitan Atlanta area of the state of Georgia. We currently have data from about 850 parents and children as we track them over the course of a year. As you can imagine, it is a huge data set. And so we're still in the process of cleaning that up, but we're super excited to find out how long the efficacy will last, because I have no expectation that this will last for a year. It's virtually impossible to do that at this point, but we are interested in at what point does the novelty wear off, and are we able to do something about it? And the key question here is that when the novelty wears off, then does the social relationship that children feel with the virtual agents counteract against the novelty wearing off and children basically losing interest in that intervention? And so it's our hope that once they build that relationship, even when the novelty of this intervention wears off, there's some reason, there's motivation for them to continue seeking out interactions with the virtual agents. And after a certain period of time, they find that it becomes internalized so that they no longer need that crutch of that virtual agent. And as you can see, you can imagine that during these interactions, as they go on, the parent is still in that loop, right? So the parents are still texting with their kids and communicating with them and sending them messages and encouragement as well. And so at a certain point, are the kids able to lose that crutch of the virtual agents and internalize the physical activity conversation and the movement between the parent and the child towards this communal goal, this common goal of engaging in physical activity together after that 1 year point? And so we're still going through the data, but we're hopeful, and the data looks fairly positive at this point, in terms of at least having good body composition indicators. So they seem to be decreasing in terms of BMI, their bodily composition. So we measure height, weight, body fat percentage, things like that. And so we're super excited to be able to share this data fairly soon. So in terms of the theoretical implications, we've really looked at virtual agents as a different entity that really doesn't communicate with human beings. And if they do, it's more of a computer and the user. But in terms of having longer term relationships, we could think of new types of relationship categories and how we build these relationships with computers over time. And so when we say interpersonal, the interpersonal communication might not always be with a human entity. What about embodied AI that can seem very human-like? Or what about the warranting value of information from these agents? So when the agents deliver information to us, how credible do we think that it is? So when we talk to children, they seem to think that because of the consistent feedback over time, so over months, the virtual agents will give them positive feedback. And that seems to add a lot of credibility in terms of what the virtual pet tells them. And so in terms of that warranting value, because it's from a computer, do people trust it more? Or do they feel like, well, you're not a human, so I don't know what to make of the information that you provide to me? And so these are some interesting questions that we're able to ask in the future. And we're really going to have to think about re-examining the communication expectations and the violations of those expectations. So when it comes to a point where we're really discussing the relationships and the meaning of those relationships with these virtual agents, it breaks the norms, right? The social normative beliefs that we have about what it means to have an interpersonal relationship. And when that happens, when the theory of computers are social actors, or that framework, when that's expanded, and people are really fighting against the social norms that we have about what it means to have a normal relationship, then I think it's going to lead to a lot of communication questions that we need to look into. So this is our final section that I wanted to cover. This year I came into South Korea, and it seems like everybody is talking about the metaverse. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how virtual experiences have gone from solo experiences to much more of a social experience. So in the past, the bulk of our virtual reality studies have focused on individual experiences and how the individual user responds to different structural features or content features. And now we're interested in how multi-user spaces can change the way that we interact. And what does that mean in terms of having embodied, synchronous, multi-user experiences in virtual reality? So these immersive spaces are called social VR. And again, they're not completely new. They have been studied under the term collective, or I think they're called collective environment or multi-user environments. And so MMORs, where people have been looking at, or the collaborative virtual spaces. So they have been studied under collaborative virtual spaces, and now they're being called more popularly as social VR. And these are basically spaces that allow for embodied interactions, where you're able to go into the same virtual space as an avatar and interact with other avatars sharing the same virtual space. And so they're very useful for overcoming physical distances, and particularly during the year of COVID, you might have read about a lot of media stories of how people use these virtual spaces, these social VR spaces, for virtual classes or virtual conferences. In the past, there was a space called Second Life. And Second Life was, again, one of these collaborative virtual spaces or social VR spaces that allow for avatars to interact with each other. Now, what was different about that Second Life space compared to what we're seeing these days is that Second Life tried to create a very persistent world. So that metaverse is built, and the relationships and the experiences that you had in that virtual space stayed persistent. So you built a house, that house stayed there. You met other friends, those friends stayed there. When you build something, when you purchase something, the objects, although they were virtual, tended to be persistent over time. The social VR spaces that we see today tend to be much more ephemeral, meaning that you create a room, you meet other avatars in the same space, and that room disappears. Or you can create an object, you play with it with other avatars in that space, and then after the session, it disappears. So it's sort of a lighter version of the metaverse that we have seen in the past. And this brings forth, again, lots of questions that are quite different from what we've been seeing in the past decades or so. And in March of 2020, IEEE VR was one of the first conferences that had to go fully virtual. And this is a virtual reality, it's one of the biggest virtual reality conferences internationally. And they decided to use a social VR space called Mozilla Hubs in order to allow for their participants to interact with each other during that conference week. And so people are able to use Mozilla Hubs using a multitude of devices. So you don't necessarily need a virtual reality headset. You can join Hubs using a personal computer, a mobile device, a VR headset, or a tablet. So any one of these devices are able to be used in order for you to meet in the same space as an avatar. And we had created over 90 rooms for the conference. And had people interact in these different rooms with different purposes. But then they also had other platforms that people could use to interact with each other. So in addition to Mozilla Hubs, They also offered a live streaming platform called Twitch. They offered a asynchronous chatting platform, internet chatting platform called Slack. They also offered Slido, which is a Q&A platform, and social media. So they offered different types of media platforms so that the users or the attendees are essentially able to pick and choose whatever platform that they need to fulfill their task that they had at the conference. So it created this really interesting natural environment for communication scholars to look at, well, what is the most appropriate media that people choose to solve or to address a certain task that they have at this conference? Typically, in the past, communication theory and technology scholarship has generally assumed that high social presence is good and high technology, high interactivity, high immersiveness, this is all good stuff, right? So social presence theory, media appropriateness theory, media richness, social affordances, all of these theories tend to assume that when you have high social presence and you feel like you're really there interacting with other people, this tends to be sort of the motivator for people selecting that media platform and to use that. So one opposite example, one exception would be the social information processing theory by Walther, which says that it really doesn't matter what platform you're using or whether that presents high levels of social presence, because if you give people and users enough time, they're able to work around that barrier and gain sufficient social information from each other. But typically, most of the communication theories have generally assumed that if you have a good technology that creates that perception of you interacting with another person, so high social presence, then people tend to use that. And the focus of past studies have largely been on task media fit, and they really haven't given a lot of attention to the context or the situation in which people are using that media platform. And the COVID-19 situation presented a really natural environment, again, in terms of how people work in different contexts, right? Because a lot of people were attending the conference from their homes, their personal homes. So now they're trying to work against a lot of social constraints and contextual constraints provided because they are working in their home environment and not in their home, or they're not in their work office situations. And so at the conference, attendees had to tend to different tasks like listening to talks or socializing, discussing research with others. And they had a wide array of options of media platforms to choose from. And the attendees of IEEE VR naturally were from virtual reality scholarship. So most of them are from computer science and engineering disciplines. And if you had to choose one group of people who would be the most open to the idea of using immersive VR, it would be these people, because they are experts, they're experienced, and they have access to technology at home. And so we wanted to ask, well, given these situations, what platform would these people feel is the most appropriate for attending this virtual conference? And so we had a collection of methods where we conducted a survey, observation studies, and interviews as well. And unsurprisingly, attendees really tend to miss that social interaction that takes place in person. So they felt that IEEE VR was the most effective for attending talks, and it was the least effective for socializing. So they said things like, you know, I really like to meet people in the conference halls and run into them. And that's where I get a lot of my conference experience, and I miss that the most. But you can see that in terms of social presence, it was the highest in Mozilla Hubs compared to all other platforms. And so although they felt that Hubs had the highest level of social presence, people still thought that IEEE VR was the least effective for socializing. And a part of the reason might be because of that situational constraint, because what's really interesting about this situation is that Although users miss the social interaction and they have the experience and the expertise and even access to technology, if you look at the graph on the bottom left-hand corner, Twitch, which is the live stream website, was the main platform used, and Hubs was still a second compared to Twitch. But what's interesting about this is that 61% of the attendees had a VR headset at home, like they had it on their desk right next to them. But only a third of them used the VR headset to actually participate in this conference, knowing very well that the VR headset would provide the highest level of social presence, but they still opted and chose to watch the conference over a 2D website. And so based on a lot of the interviews, we find that there are fundamentally different orientation to virtual and in-person conferences. So when we attend in-person conferences, we tend to drop everything for that week because we travel to a completely different location. So we make accommodations for things like childcare, or if we have lectures, we make sure that all of these things are covered. But in terms of in-person or virtual conferences, no one makes that type of accommodation because, again, we are working with the environment, the situational context of us being at home. And so we have a fundamentally different orientation towards attending virtual conferences that it is not equal to the way that we approach in-person conferences. And based on our interviews, when social presence is successful, it's actually very appropriate and it's appreciated. So these spontaneous social events that are generated by users. So some user will say, I want to open up a room with this theme and everybody come join me for social interaction in this themed room. That was very popular. And so one person said, via Hubs, this experience was incredible. I was so impressed at how much it reflected the feeling of being at a conference in person. Poster sessions were also very successful. So again, poster sessions require some level of sharing the same space where you walk through the posters, through an alley of posters and talk to and interact with the author of that poster. So it's a much more interactive event that really can't be replicated through other platforms. And then we also offered the service of 3 talks at once. So this really addresses that difficulty of being at a conference where you want to attend multiple talks at once, but you're not able to do that because you only have one physical body. In virtual reality, we're able to use the element of spatial audio where you're in the same space, but when you fly over to this section of the room, that's one talk, that's one division. When you fly into the middle section, you can immediately, it's sort of like channel switching, channel flipping, but you can sort of look at 3 different talks in the same virtual space that are all divided by spatial audio so that you hear the general murmur, but you don't, you're still able to have conversations within that location that's much more clear than the murmur that you hear in the background. So it's sort of equivalent to being in a coffee shop where there's a lot of people, or at a reception where there's a lot of people, but you can still have conversations with the people who are immediately in the vicinity. And so we were able to offer this 3 talks at once feature where people really appreciated this unique feature that's available because it's a virtual reality platform. And so they said, I love the ability to check out of the corner of my eye what was happening in the other streams. And people gathered together in this way as avatars, and they felt that it was easier to approach people that you don't know because it feels less intimidating. For instance, easier to join the conversations than in the physical presence. That's usually a lot more difficult to get into that circle, especially if you're an introvert. Then people said that it's really difficult to break into circles formed at conferences, but when you are avatar, so for instance, when that big name scholar is a panda, for example, they seem to be much more approachable as an avatar versus when they are in person at a physical conference. And so when the social presence is appropriate and we're able to offer unique value, then it's perceived to be very successful. In terms of the theoretical implications, we find that media appropriateness, again, really isn't just about platforms and users, but you do have to take into account the situational contexts and the constraints that they have to deal with, because the users are much more strategic in the platforms that they choose. And it's not just them being exposed to a technology platform and then wanting to use it. They strategically choose and will say, although I have the experience, expertise, and even the technology at hand, because I need to deal with a constraint in my environment, I won't use virtual reality headsets. I much rather would like to watch this on a website or send an email versus having a synchronous Zoom. And so in earlier communication scholarship, we really haven't given a lot of thought to the situational context and the constraints that users have to work with. And so I think this is a future direction that we all need to think about, because it's not just the cool technology that people want, it's usefulness, right? It's the utility of the platform that they strategically choose to overcome certain environmental constraints. And in terms of next steps for virtual reality, VR tends to lack a general effects theory, and that makes it really difficult to sort of work with this platform. And so in the lab, we're working towards, well, what does it mean to use not just VR, but the immersive technologies that are up and coming? And in terms of general impact, what are we looking at? Why does it make it different from, let's say, more traditional media? Is it different, for example, than traditional media? If so, in what ways? And Shyam Sundar has mentioned multiple times, and I agree 100%, that we need to move beyond, here's a cool effect study based on VR systems. So it doesn't mean that just exposing people to VR leads to some sort of an effect. I'm sure it does, but I don't think we need to spend any more time on that, but maybe questions of why is it important? How is it important? How does it work? When does it work? To whom? And for how long? So these more complicated questions in terms of users, the media platform, and the situational contexts need to be considered in order for virtual reality scholarship to advance in the future. So that is it for me today. I hope it was all worth your time. Thank you.